Hey guys, today in this short video, I'm gonna show you everything you need to know to start making awesome HDR images with your DJI Mini 2. There's lots to talk about, so let's get right to it. Now, before we dive into the details, I just want to quickly talk about why we would want to create an HDR or high dynamic range image in the first place. All camera sensors have a limitation on how much dynamic range from the brightest brights to the darkest darks that they can effectively capture with detail in a single image. In a high contrast scene, when you set your exposure for the highlights, you may notice that the shadow areas of your image become almost completely black with no detail. The opposite occurs when you expose for the shadows. The brightest areas of your image may get blown out and appear as pure white with no detail at all. This is basically you bumping up against the dynamic range limitation of your camera. On small sensor cameras like the DJI Mini 2, dynamic range can be fairly limited. Smaller sensors mean smaller light gathering photo sites, and that translates into less dynamic range. Shooting in the RAW format gives us a bit more latitude to play with, but it too has its limits. So in order to get around this limitation and reveal more detail in a high contrast scene, we need to take multiple exposures and then combine those exposures with software to create an HDR image. With the DJI Mini 2, this is done by using the AEB or auto exposure bracketing feature in photo mode. When you take a picture using auto exposure bracketing, it actually captures 3 images in rapid succession, automatically varying the shutter speed between images. One image is captured with no exposure bias, one image is overexposed or brighter by 2/3 of a stop, and one image is underexposed or darker by 2/3 of a stop. This is done to reveal as much detail as possible in both the shadow and highlight areas. Now, it's worth noting here that the Mini 2 only shoots 3 images in auto exposure bracketing mode, whereas DJI's more expensive drones like the Mavic Air 2S have the option of shooting up to 5 bracketed images. 3 is pretty much the minimum number necessary for making a good HDR image. Okay, let's quickly go over some basic camera settings to help us get the best results. Now, the biggest thing here is to make sure that you set the image format to be RAW plus JPEG. We want to use RAW images for our HDR merge because they are uncompressed and unprocessed, and that gives us the most amount of information to work with in post. Same goes for photo size. Always choose the 4:3 aspect ratio because it uses the full size of the camera sensor, not a cropped version like the 16:9 aspect ratio. And finally, I like to shoot everything manual white balance, manual exposure, but honestly, that doesn't matter too much. You could shoot everything in auto and still get good results. Now, that's basically all you have to worry about for camera settings, but there are a few more things to consider. HDR photography is all about trying to accurately capture the detail in high contrast scenes. So that's what you should be thinking about when composing a shot. If you're shooting towards the sun or a scene where everything is quite bright and lacking contrast, it's not going to make for a good HDR photo. You also want to avoid moving subjects. Remember, auto exposure bracketing is going to take multiple shots. So if you have things moving in your frame, that could cause problems that you have to deal with in post. And finally, you should avoid low light situations and windy days. HDR photography is typically done on a tripod because the camera should remain still between shots. That's not possible with the drone, but by avoiding situations where you would use a slower shutter speed or the drone is going to be moving a lot, we give ourselves the best chance of success. Okay, enough tips. Let's make an HDR image. Now, this final step requires some additional software, and for this I use a photo editor called Affinity Photo. It's an excellent piece of software. I use it for all my YouTube thumbnails and my photography work. It costs about $75 Canadian, one time, no subscription, and I will put a link in the description if you want to check it out. I highly recommend it. To create an HDR image in Affinity Photo, I go to the File menu and choose New HDR Merge. That brings up a new window where I can select the images I want to use for the HDR photo. To import them, I click on Add, I select my images, and then I click Open. Now, for the most part, I usually just go with the HDR Merge defaults, but there are a couple things to note. If you know you have some objects moving in your frame like a car or something, you definitely want to turn on Automatically Remove Ghosts. The software will then look at each of the images in the merge and do its best to eliminate those problem objects. Next, if you shot JPEG images instead of RAW, I would also recommend turning off noise reduction. JPEG images are already processed and compressed, so leaving noise reduction on will only degrade the images further. And that's it. Just hit OK and let the software do its thing. The processing time is obviously going to be dependent on the speed of your computer and the individual images. Once that first process is complete, we can move on to making some final adjustments. Now, Affinity Photo has a whole bunch of HDR presets to choose from, which is a great place to start. For this example, I'm going to use the Texas Anvil preset, which I think has a very cool, very dramatic look. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty good, but I want to make a few more adjustments. I tend to like images really saturated, so I will boost up the saturation a bit. I also find the white balance to be too warm, so I'll drag the temperature slider over to make it a bit cooler, and I'll also remove some of the red tint. And finally, I will adjust the curve to pull some of that red out of the highlights. I think that looks pretty good, so I can just hit apply to complete the HDR merge. And that's basically it. Easy peasy. If you want to share your creation with others, you can just go into the File menu and export it as a JPEG image, and you're done. Now, one final thought I want to leave you guys with here is there is no right or wrong when it comes to editing your images. This is your creation, your art, so just experiment, have a little fun, and make it all your own. And that's it for this one, guys. I hope this video gave you a good starting point for creating HDR images with your DJI Mini 2. If you found this video helpful, I'd totally appreciate a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.